Los Angeles never sleeps. The traffic was still bustling under the bright lights as I drove home after a long day at the police station. A police chief's job is not only about investigations and arrests, but also about paperwork, endless meetings, and countless internal issues to resolve. There were no major cases today, but my mind was still spinning with urgent calls, piles of reports, and endless budget debates. Turning onto Vermont Avenue, I decided to pull into a space on the side of the road near Griffith Park. The area was not too crowded in the evening, mostly a few late joggers, a few couples strolling, and a few cars parked here and there. I chose a spot under a row of large trees, not far from the entrance to the park. The space here was much quieter than the hustle and bustle of downtown, with only the sound of the wind blowing through the leaves and the occasional car speeding on the main road in the distance. I turned off the computer, leaned back in my chair, and let out a long sigh. The feeling of relief only lasted a few seconds before my mind returned to work. Unfinished cases, unfinished investigations, important decisions to make, all lined up in my head like a tape that never stopped playing. I closed my eyes, trying to block out those thoughts, at least for a few minutes. Over the years of being a cop, I was used to pressure, but there were days like today when even a seasoned cop felt overwhelmed. The job required more than toughness. It also required presence of mind, patience, and empathy for the people I interacted with every day, whether they were victims, criminals, or ordinary residents of this city. Being a cop wasn't just about making arrests. It was about resolving conflicts, mediating, and sometimes just listening to someone vent. I opened the car door a little to breathe in the air. The night wind blew in, carrying a bit of moisture from the park grass, a rare sense of peace in the middle of the noisy city. I don't know how long I sat there, but at that moment, just as I was about to start the car to leave, a sharp voice rang out outside the window. I turned my head. A middle-aged woman with golden hair, wearing large sunglasses, was standing with her arms crossed, looking at me with an arrogant expression. Her face was wrinkled, her lips pressed tightly together as if she was trying to suppress her anger, and then she knocked hard on my car window. I knew right away trouble had just come. I looked out the car window, my eyes meeting the middle-aged woman standing right next to me. Her face was wrinkled with displeasure, her lips pressed tightly together as if she was about to spit out criticism. I can spot this type of person right away. Overconfident, always thinking he's right, and not afraid to show his attitude to anyone he doesn't like. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest for a few seconds, tilting her chin slightly toward my car as if to force me to figure it out. When I remained silent, she knocked hard on the window, not politely, but with a hint of annoyance. I slowly rolled it down, keeping my face calm. She didn't wait for me to say anything, but immediately raised her voice. "You can't stop here." Her voice was sharp with a hint of command, as if she were addressing a subordinate rather than a stranger on the street. I glanced around. The road was wide, there were no parking signs, and there was no sign that I was obstructing traffic or bothering anyone, but clearly she didn't care about any of that. Before I could reply, she continued, her tone growing more and more annoyed. "Do you know what you're doing? This is not a place for anyone to stop. What you're doing is irresponsible, affecting everyone around you." She spoke with the same indignation as if I had just parked in the middle of the freeway during rush hour. Her tone was as indignation as if I had just parked in the middle of the freeway during rush hour. I looked in the rearview mirror. No one was affected. Maybe she was a resident of the area or simply a meddlesome person. I've met many people like that in my career, people who believe they have the right to control everything around them, that the world operates according to their own standards. I kept my cool, not letting myself get caught up in a fit of rage. I knew this type of person well. The more they react, the more they get into trouble. Instead of arguing right away, I just asked gently, "I don't understand. Did I bother anyone? She rolled her eyes, looking incredulous, as if my question was a huge insult. Of course you did. This is a quiet residential area. We can't have suspicious people like you stopping your car so casually. Who knows what your intention? I couldn't help but smile. It was a classic line from someone like her. Suspicious person? I was still wearing a neat shirt, my hair was neat, and there was nothing that would make me look like a threat. But apparently just being here was enough for her to feel the need to intervene. She crossed her arms and shook her head in disapproval. I could see the displeasure written on her face, as if I had broken some unwritten rule that only she knew. The displeasure wasn't simply from the fact that I had parked, but also from the fact that I hadn't immediately yielded to her words. I glanced at my watch, thinking that I should probably just keep driving instead of wasting time with this pointless situation. But before I could say anything, she pulled out her phone and pressed a number with a decisive tone. I could tell what was coming next, and sure enough, as soon as she put the phone to my ear, I could hear her voice, filled with frustration. "Hello? I want to call the police. There's a suspicious man parked here, and I feel threatened." I sighed softly, folded my arms, and leaned back in my seat, waiting to see where this would go. I remained where I was, quietly observing, neither surprised nor in a hurry to intervene. This was not the first time I had encountered people like her, people who believed they had control over everything around them and would turn a small incident into a huge one just because they could. She announced that there was an unidentified man parked suspiciously near Griffith Park, emphasizing the word suspicious with conviction. I could imagine the operators frowning, trying to understand the seriousness of the situation, but before they could react, she firmly stated that I was a potential threat and requested the police to come immediately. I relaxed, leaning back in my chair, listening as she added details that surprised me. She claimed that I had been parked suspiciously for a long time, that I might have been stalking someone or preparing to commit a crime. There was no evidence, but the firmness of her tone and the certainty in her words made it sound like a well-founded accusation. I had seen people manipulate situations with fear, but this one still surprised me. She had no idea who I was, no reason to suspect me, but her personal feelings were enough to make me a suspect. Some people don't need proof, they just take it for granted. In less than 2 minutes, she had created a complete scenario, portraying herself as a model citizen protecting the community from a dangerous man. When she ended the call, she put the phone in her pocket and looked at me triumphantly, confident that the police would arrive shortly to deal with the problem she had just created. I said nothing, just watched silently. I knew the procedure. The nearest patrol would receive the report, they would assess the situation based on priority, and if deemed necessary, they would send a unit to investigate. She did not know that the person she had just reported to was the head of the police department in this area. She stood there, arms folded, waiting with pride. I could see the conviction in her eyes that the police would come, that they would deal with me immediately, perhaps ask me to leave or even question me on the spot. And in the scenario she had drawn up in her head, she would be the one being protected, the model citizen who had made this city safer. I was in no hurry to leave. I wanted to see how things would play out. Because if there was one thing I had learned in my years as a cop, it was that sometimes the truth had a way of coming out in the most unexpected ways, and this time I believed it would come in a way she never expected. I sat still, watching the red and blue lights reflect off the trees along the road. The sound of sirens broke the silence, drawing the attention of the people around me. 2 patrol cars slowed to a stop right behind me. The doors opened and 2 officers stepped out, walking briskly but not hurriedly, indicating that they did not take the situation seriously. I immediately recognized Jake Reynolds, the young police officer I had trained. Despite his enthusiasm and potential, he lacked experience in assessing situations. Today, perhaps because he was focused on the task at hand, he did not recognize me. Both officers approached, their eyes on my car, while Mrs. Johnson folded her arms, proud as the police arrived. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her voice full of authority, rattling off the threat I posed, insisting that she had done the right thing by calling the police. I didn't need to hear to know that she was trying to make herself out to be a model citizen, protecting the community from a dangerous man. Reynolds listened quietly, nodding slightly, keeping his demeanor professional. His expression was calm, not tense or rushed, just taking in the information professionally. I was glad he was being objective, but in a moment he would notice something important that she hadn't anticipated. But when he turned to me, he paused. His gaze lingered for a few seconds, then he frowned, as if trying to confirm that he had seen correctly. I waited. A second, 2 seconds, then his eyes widened, disbelief quickly turning to shock. I could see the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together in his mind as he realized that the person he had reported was his immediate superior, Chief Thompson. A momentary silence passed between us. I didn't rush to break it. I wanted Reynolds to assess the situation for himself, to draw his own conclusions, rather than have me explain it. Real-life lessons were always more valuable than any training session, and this was one of those moments he would never forget. I saw his demeanor change, from professional when he took the report, to hesitant when he recognized me, to quickly suppressing his reaction to maintain his composure. He looked at Mrs. Johnson, then back at me, clearly torn between surprise and the responsibility of an officer on duty. I remained silent, just sitting there, letting things take their natural course. The other woman had yet to notice anything out of the ordinary, too preoccupied with her sense of triumph. But I knew that in a moment the situation would change in ways she could never have imagined. I looked straight at Reynolds, keeping my composure, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. For a few seconds I could see the struggle between him. One side maintaining the professional demeanor of receiving the report, the other side filled with shock when realizing that the suspect was his immediate superior. Reynolds glanced quickly at his colleague, as if to confirm that he wasn't the only one who noticed the irony of the situation, but the other officer remained neutral, probably having never met me in person or not recognizing who I was. Reynolds swallowed, straightened, and blurted out, forgetting the situation and all normal investigative procedures, "Boss?" It was a simple word, but it broke the silence. I saw Mrs. Johnson flinch. She turned to Reynolds, then back to me, clearly not quite understanding what was happening. Reynolds blinked as if checking to see if he had said it out loud, but he had, and there was no taking it back. I kept quiet, not reacting, letting him adjust to the situation. I wanted to see how he would proceed, how he would handle the realization that he had just called the suspect boss in front of a very serious complainant. Mrs. Johnson, after a few seconds of shock, began to change. I saw the confusion in her eyes as she looked from Reynolds to me, as if trying to piece together a mismatch of information. Her initial confidence seemed shaken, but instead of accepting it immediately, she clung to her composure. "Sir?" she repeated, her voice laced with doubt. Reynolds pursed his lips, clearly trying to figure out how to interpret the situation without making it more confusing. He shifted his weight to his other foot, blinked again, and took a deep breath, as if considering his next course of action. But there are times in policing when theory becomes meaningless, and this was one of them. I remained calm, but I couldn't help but be amused by the turn of events. Reynolds finally turned to Mrs. Johnson, but instead of continuing to act like an officer processing a report, he suddenly became more serious, almost tense, as if reporting to a superior. "Ma'am," Reynolds began, but then hesitated. He couldn't just turn around and tell her that the person she had just reported to was the chief of police. That wasn't in any of his training. Mrs. Johnson began to back away, perhaps sensing that this was not going the way she wanted it to. I could see the worry creeping into her face as she looked from Reynolds to me. She might not have known exactly who I was, but she clearly realized she had missed something important. I didn't need to say anything. The silence between us spoke for itself. Reynolds swallowed again, then regained his composure and turned to Mrs. Johnson, this time with a different expression. I knew this moment would come, the moment she realized she had just called the police on the man who was leading them, and I knew, too, that in that moment, panic was beginning to creep into her eyes. I looked at Mrs. Johnson as the words rang out, and the impact was immediate. The confidence in her face evaporated instantly. Her skin turned pale, as if the blood had drained from her. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Her eyes wide, trying to take in the truth, but unable to fully accept it. I didn't need to say anything more. My silence made the situation all the more unbearable for her. Her breathing quickened, her shoulders hunched slightly, as if trying to withdraw from my gaze. I'd seen many reactions when someone realized something was seriously wrong, and Mrs. Johnson's was no exception. Not anger or argument, but quiet panic as she realized she'd gotten herself into a situation she couldn't control. She blinked repeatedly, as if hoping that when she opened her eyes the situation would change, that what Reynolds had said wasn't true. But when she looked back at me, when her eyes slid to the police badge on my chest, when she realized that she had just called the police to report the head of the police force, the truth became undeniable. I didn't show any anger, nor did I blame her. I just stayed silent, letting her deal with the consequences of her actions. She took a deep breath, then took a step back as if to put some distance between us, but didn't know what to do next. I could tell what was going through her mind. Should she apologize? Should she justify herself? Or should she just turn away and pretend nothing had happened? But none of those options could erase the truth. She had filed a false report. She had created a false situation, causing the police to dispatch a unit to the scene based on her own misjudgment. And now she was not just dealing with a regular police officer, but with the person who had the direct authority to decide whether she would be held accountable for her actions. I kept my voice even as I spoke, not loud, not soft, but enough for her to understand that I was not taking this lightly. Miss Johnson, are you aware that you have filed a false police report? I didn't need to say more. I saw her shoulders stiffen, her hands tremble slightly, her eyes darted around as if searching for an escape, but this time there was no escape. She knew she was wrong, and more importantly, she knew that I knew it too. A long silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant honk of a car horn echoing down the main road. I remained where I was, waiting to see how she would choose to face the consequences of her actions. Ms. Johnson stood there, eyes still wide, face still pale, after realizing her grave mistake. The initial arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by confusion and fear. I could see how she was trying to find a way out, some excuse to erase this embarrassing situation, but the truth was too obvious. There was nothing she could say to change what had just happened. I took a deep breath, keeping my tone calm but firm as I spoke. I didn't need to show anger or raise my voice to make her understand the severity of my actions. The situation spoke for itself. I looked at her directly, my voice low but sharp. I emphasized that reporting a false report was not only irresponsible, but could have serious consequences. Dispatching the police based on personal prejudice not only wasted resources, but could delay a real emergency response. In a city like Los Angeles, where minutes can mean life or death, false calls like this were not only irresponsible, but potentially dangerous. She swallowed, her eyes wavering as if searching for an escape. But this time there was no escape. I didn't need her to apologize, her silence said it all. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. her eyes still wavering. I could tell what was going through her mind. She was debating whether to apologize, justify herself, or simply keep quiet and hope I would let it go. But I wasn't about to let her get away with this without learning a lesson. I held her gaze, making sure she understood that this was more than just a warning. I made it clear that if she did it again, she could face legal consequences. I didn't want to turn this into an arrest, but I also couldn't let this become a precedent for abusing the right to call the police. People like Ms. Johnson, who see the police as tools to impose their will, are part of the problem we face every day. If no one steps up to stop it, this behavior will continue. She bowed her head a little, her eyes averted, as if finally realizing that she had pushed the situation too far. I didn't need her to apologize, because her silence made it clear that she understood her mistake, but I wanted to make sure she remembered this moment, that the next time she wanted to call the police to solve a problem that didn't exist, she would think twice. The air between us was heavy, broken only by the sound of passing cars on the highway in the distance. I held my position for a few seconds, watching her one last time, then exhaled slowly. I had said what I needed to say. Now she would have to face the consequences of her own arrogance and prejudice. Mrs. Johnson stood there, her hands clasped together as if she were holding something back. The initial overbearing confidence had vanished, replaced by confusion that was written all over her face. She was no longer in control, no longer shouting orders or forcing others to respond. Instead, she was diminished by the situation she had created. I could see the hesitation in her eyes. Part of her still wanted to justify herself, to find some reason to regain some control. But the silence between us told her that there was nothing she could say that would change the truth. Any excuses were meaningless now, and she knew it. The police had come at her request, but instead of finding a suspect, they had found her own superior, someone she should never have tried to trouble. She took a deep breath, as if considering the last thing she should do. I remained calm, not needing to force her to admit her mistake, because the silence between us was a clearer admission than any words. I didn't need her to apologize because whether she said it or not, she was aware of the consequences of her actions. She glanced at Reynolds, perhaps expecting some help, but the young officer remained motionless, making no move to intervene. Her gaze shifted to me again, and then after a moment's hesitation, she decided to do the only thing she could do: to leave. After a few tense seconds, she turned and walked away, her steps quicker than necessary. Her steps were hesitant at first, but then she picked up speed, her high heels clicking hastily on the pavement. I didn't turn to follow, but I could sense the urgency in her steps, an escape from a situation she never wanted to revisit. I was silent for a few seconds, waiting for her to disappear. Reynolds stood still, seemingly stunned. There was disbelief in his eyes, but also a deeper understanding of how people behave in situations like this. This would probably be a lesson he would remember for the rest of his career. I let out a sigh, reached for the key, and started the car. The engine roared smoothly, blending into the newly restored silence. I didn't have to look to know that Reynolds was still watching, probably wondering if I was angry, but in truth, I didn't care. Situations like this weren't uncommon, and I'd seen enough of them to know that they weren't worth losing my temper over. I pressed the accelerator lightly, letting the car roll slowly out of Griffith Park. The street lights flashed past the windshield, blending into the still sleeping city night. As I merged into traffic on Vermont Avenue, a thought crossed my mind. I had just learned another memorable story. A story about how people sometimes get themselves into situations beyond their control, and how prejudice can make someone believe they're right when the truth is completely different. I smiled briefly, not because of the joy, but because of the gentle irony of the situation. Even after years in the industry, I've found that people have a way of making things more complicated than they need to be, and sometimes all I have to do is sit back, watch, and let them figure out their own mistakes. Tonight's situation is not the first time I've encountered it, and it certainly won't be the last. But it raises an important question. Do we ever wonder whether what we believe is actually true, or if it's just an imposition of our personal feelings? Do we unintentionally judge someone wrongly just because they don't fit our expectations? Let's take a moment before jumping to conclusions about someone. Look at things with reason instead of prejudice, because sometimes what we think is a threat is actually just a normal part of the world around us. Have you ever unintentionally judged someone wrongly based on your first impression? Share your thoughts, and let's discuss how we can be more fair and open-minded in our views of others. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next interesting content.